Welcome back, everyone, to the Jake Broe Show. Today on the channel, we are joined by the first member of Congress to reach out to me and say he wants to speak to our audience. He wants to speak to you. So I am ecstatic to welcome Congressman Jake Auchincloss. I hope I'm saying that correct. He's a Democrat representing Massachusetts' 4th Congressional District. Congressman, how are you doing today?
I'm well, Jake. Thank you for having me on. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
So as far as your resume, I looked at it on Wikipedia. It's very impressive. I think you're a Harvard and MIT graduate, and you served in the Marines. Can you also just introduce yourself to the audience?
Yes, I represent the suburbs of Boston in Congress. I'm going into my 3rd term now. In Congress, I am on the Committee of Energy and Commerce, which has jurisdiction over tech, social media, energy, healthcare, consumer protections, the environment. Last term, I served on the Select Committee on China, and so very engaged on questions of foreign policy, particularly as they relate to U.S.-China competition. I've been a ferocious advocate of Ukraine since the invasion 3 years ago and remain committed to Western defense of our ally. And then I grew up in the suburbs of Boston, the son of a surgeon and a scientist. I grew up really with bone-deep respect, in particular for medical science, and I've tried to take that mentality of curiosity with me into first the Marine Corps and then into business and then into local government and now into Congress.
So this is your 3rd term, so you've served a little over 4 years in Congress.
That's right.
All right, so I need to get your reaction to what happened on Friday. With Donald Trump and the news cycles, everything moves very fast. We're going to get this podcast up very quickly. But I have to get your thoughts and opinions. What does this mean for the United States? What does this mean for our relationship with Ukraine and the NATO partners after this meltdown that happened in the Oval Office?
One of the most shameful exchanges in the history of the Oval Office. Volodymyr Zelensky flew to Washington, D.C., but he walked into the Kremlin. And to hear an American president regurgitate Russian propaganda in front of a portrait of former great American presidents was really a nauseating sensation. I thought Volodymyr Zelensky handled himself as well as could be expected, given the shock of that moment. And I also think it's important for our listeners to understand the politics of what happened. That was not extemporaneous. That was J.D. Vance trying to claim the standard of MAGA to position himself at the front of the pack for 2028. J.D. Vance is a little bully. Donald Trump's a big bully. And the way that little bullies impress big bullies is that they try to bully somebody else in front of the big bully. And that's what you saw in the Oval Office for geopolitics. This was J.D. Vance trying to flex to crowd out the prospective primary field.
J.D. Vance definitely did antagonize, and he mixed it up with Zelensky, which then triggered Trump. But it was also just the other actors in the room. I want to mention, I believe his name is Brian Glenn with Voices for America. This is a pro-Trump blog that got White House press credentials. And this guy is Marjorie Taylor Greene's boyfriend. And he's the one who asked the question about, do you even own a suit? And Zelensky respond, I'll wear, what was his word? I'll wear a costume when the war is over. So I just want to get your reaction to Marjorie Taylor Greene's boyfriend being invited into the White House. Time and space is limited in there with world leaders. And he was allowed to ask this absurd question, this insulting question that served no purpose. And I can't help but look at the video footage of when he's asking this question. Trump and J.D. Vance are smirking. Rubio looks embarrassed. Waltz looks embarrassed. Keith Kellogg looks embarrassed. But I see the smirks on J.D. Vance's and Trump's face when MAGA, they seem fixated on this point about Zelensky not wearing a suit when he's in the White House.
When you pull on this thread, I think it unravels to 3 places. The first is that MAGA has dominated new media over the last 5 years. Something happened during COVID that Democrats are still catching up with, which is that creator media, and particularly creator media distributed through social media, is beginning to devour corporate media. And Jake, I mean, your show is a terrific example of this. It's one of the, it's one of the upshots of this phenomenon, as you know better than me. Democrats have not gotten traction in this new reality. And this is sort of a logical conclusion of that, is that you get Marjorie Taylor Greene's boyfriend, who in the days of Walter Cronkite would have been a fringe voice, is now front and center in the Oval Office. Now, that can be an asset for the right. It allows them to take memes from the fringes into the mainstream very fast. It allows them to have a creative intertwining of different memes to come up with new policies rapidly. And they have sort of this online laboratory of idea popularity. And that can be an advantage. In the military, we'd call it an OODA loop, a really fast ability to observe, orient, decide, and act. It's also a liability. And it's a liability because when you create an echo chamber online, you get pulled to the flanks real fast. It is centrifugal, not centripetal. And it's going to alienate mainstream Americans. Mainstream Americans, and Jake, again, you know this better than me, like Ukraine and support Ukraine and don't want to see the American president echoing Russian propaganda. That's true now. That was true 3 years ago. That'll be true 3 years from now. Ideological opinion about U.S. national security is an aircraft carrier. It shifts slowly. And what the president is doing regarding Ukraine is unpopular. And so this echo chamber that the right has created for itself online, while it can be very creative and galvanizing, it can also become a liability, and then it pulls it far to the right. Now, Democrats experienced this a little bit ourselves too during COVID. We got pulled far to the left on defund the police, which was an online meme that kind of grappled into the real world in a very unpopular and destructive way. But they're doing the right is doing this to itself repeatedly. So how do we punch through this? On the third point, one, Democrats have to go everywhere and talk to everyone. We got to shatter echo chambers and be willing to go on every YouTube channel and podcast within broad confines of reason to talk about our ideas. And that does not just mean politically coded podcasts or YouTube channels. That means culture or sports or entertainment or music podcasts where we can insert in a 15-minute repartee 5 minutes worth of policy ideas. We got to be much more ambitious and aggressive about doing that. And then number two is we got to fund local journalism. Trust in this country is built from the bottom up. It's built through local reporting, through shoe leather that does not scale. That business model has been destroyed by the social media corporations that have monetized this country's attention span and become the wealthiest and most powerful corporations in the history of the world. We should levy a digital advertising tax on these social media corporations of up to 50% and use those funds, which would be at least $100 billion a year, to fund local journalism in this country so that we can rebuild trust.
I don't think Mark Zuckerberg liked your answer.
I hope he hated it.
Since we're talking about journalists, I have to ask you, in normal times, this would be the number one news story in America, but it's not. A TASS journalist, a Russian state propaganda agent, probably an undercover FSB officer, was granted access to this meeting in the Oval Office. The White House later claimed this person was removed and they never had authority to be there. But it begs the question, how did a Russian state journalist, a Kremlin propagandist, how did TASS media outlet get access to the Oval Office when Associated Press and Reuters are banned? Associated Press and Reuters had their press credentials taken away and they weren't present in that Oval Office meeting.
Because the White House is a pro-Kremlin enterprise. And I'll take it a step further, Jake, not to bum out our audience, but when Trump took office, he issued a meme coin in his name, Trump coin. Melania did right afterwards. It was narrated by traditional media as a marketing ploy. In fact, it was much more nefarious than that. It was actually the most brazen act of corruption in the modern presidency. What it did was allow Donald Trump to monetize the power of the presidency. Now, this idea of issuing a personal meme coin has been around for a few years. A bunch of celebrities have done it. Usually it kind of is a pump and dump scheme because there's not a lot of inherent value there. But there is a lot of inherent value in the presidency. And so what we have seen is that probably 90% of Trump's net worth is now locked up in this cryptocurrency. And any actor, domestic or foreign, can buy it with zero accountability or transparency by Congress or by the rest of the federal government or by the public. If you are Vladimir Putin, if you are the board of directors of TikTok, if you are the Qataris, if you are the Turks, do you think there is a chance that if the president of the United States allows you to buy his net worth, you're not going to do it? I can virtually guarantee you that Vladimir Putin's oligarchs own a substantial portion of Donald Trump's net worth through this meme coin.
There is how I understand it, there's a 3-month, a 6-month, and a 9-month lockup agreements for shares. But we're actually fast approaching that. We're a month and a half almost into Trump's term. So he can start cashing out as the Chinese, the Russians, the Saudis are buying in to purchase political influence. I covered this, but we're screaming into the void. Before we get into the limitations of Congress at the moment, we should talk about this mineral deal because that was the entire purpose of this visit. President Zelensky came to the United States to sign a mineral deal. Donald Trump thought he was getting $500 billion worth of the rare earth. Donald Trump had just spent a week attacking Ukraine and bullying Zelensky to get him to sign this deal. Trump then had a meltdown and the deal wasn't signed. But let's actually genuinely evaluate it on the merits of this deal. The way I understand it, it's going to be a joint venture. 50% of future mineral resources will go into this fund. This fund can then be used to invest in Ukraine. So the money has to stay in Ukraine, but it'll be American companies partnering with the government of Ukraine. Ukraine, I assume, would have veto power over the distribution of these funds to make sure that, once again, it's serving Ukraine's interest, even though this is capital expenditures on the books that will belong to American companies, making America wealthier and more prosperous. This is direct investments that Ukraine needs, managed with the expertise of American companies. The first two versions of the deal didn't make sense to me. I'm glad Zelensky didn't take the first initial offers, but the latest one on paper seemed decent. I just want to get your honest thoughts and reflections on the merit deal, independent of what happened in the Oval Office.
Co-ventures to do mineral extraction and processing make a ton of sense. And in fact, 3 years ago, I wrote an op-ed for Fox advocating that the United States do this with Afghanistan, which, like Ukraine, has tremendous mineral resources, although unlike Ukraine, doesn't have as much human or physical capital to extract and process it. I've got no issue with the United States and Ukraine and Europe doing economic development deals on extraction and processing. There's a lot of question marks about how reliable the geological survey of Ukraine is, what actually we know about the cobalt or the lithium or the nickel or the coal and iron seem a little bit more viable in the near term. But yeah, they've got the Black Sea to ship it out. They've got good rail connections. What my issue is with this is probably what your issue with it is that the cart's before the horse. You cannot have a mineral extraction and processing deal, which, round numbers, let's say it's about a $100 billion enterprise to do this. This is capital intensive. You can't have that before you have security guarantees. What company, what country for that matter, is going to put down that kind of capital when you've got the threat of an imminent war hovering over your investment? We need a security architecture for Ukraine. And I'm happy to talk more now about what I think that looks like and how it can be salvaged from this dumpster fire that Donald Trump created in the Oval Office.
Yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Go for it.
So I think the first element of it is a shared definition of victory between Ukraine, Europe, and the United States, which to me is a secure eastern border, freedom of navigation in the Black Sea, and accession to the European Union, with a shot clock of that accession has to happen by 2030, and there needs to start to be EU-Ukraine integration immediately. It can't just be you can't just be delayed until 2030 all at once. With that shared definition of victory, then we have to continue providing material support for Ukraine right now to maximize the leverage that Ukraine has at the negotiating table. And finally, we need to have, I think, a multi-layered security strategy for Ukraine that has three elements to it. One is a very hardened front line, roughly 1,000 kilometers. That includes defense structures like the Dragon's Teeth, that has precision fires interlaid amongst the mobility impairment devices, and that is manned by a combination of conscript and professional forces. You've got a strategic ready reserve behind that, probably an additional 500,000 Ukrainian troops that are all professional, highly trained forces. And then finally, you've got a reserve force that can be mobilized if necessary. This looks like what Israel and South Korea do, by the way. They spend about $20 to $40 billion a year, and have a multi-layered, part reserve, part mobilized, part professional, part non-professional series of integrated forces. And it's reasonable to expect that Ukraine, which is in a similar circumstance as Israel and South Korea is, would have a similar force. The final element would be they've got to be able to protect their cities and critical infrastructure, Patriot missiles, and the like. And they should have a reserve of batteries and of defensive weapons to do that, equal to probably a winter's worth of Russian attacks, just in reserve. So now the final question is, how do you fund all that? You fund all that with the $250 billion of Russian frozen assets. 200 billion plus so held in Brussels, the rest held in New York City. And we take that principle, we allocate some of the principal and some of the interest towards that $20 to $40 billion annually that Ukraine needs for this three-part structure of frontline, ready force, and city and critical infrastructure protection. None of that requires NATO, and it all points towards Ukraine being able to defend itself, not autonomously, but it controls its own destiny.
That all sounds very complicated. Wouldn't it just be easier to allow Ukraine to win? Just kick the Russians out back to the 1991 borders? And I think there was this debate. The first 2 weeks, Donald Trump was putting out strong statements harsh against Russia. He was listening to Rubio and Waltz and Keith Kellogg, and even the Treasury Secretary during his confirmation hearings said, the current level of sanctions against Russia is a 6, but enforcement is a 3. We can make we can make life more difficult for Russia if we actually enforce sanctions and applied harsher sanctions against Russia's oil majors, in addition to lifting all restrictions on the use of weapons delivered to Ukraine and giving them enough to actually succeed, to win on the battlefield. So I have to get your honest thoughts. Was victory ever possible? Did we miss an opportunity? And is victory still possible? Under Donald Trump, I'm skeptical that he'll take a hard turn such as this, but is it possible to just make the Russians lose?
So you're talking to one of the few Democrats who criticized Joe Biden publicly for not empowering Ukraine to strike into Russian territory against its oil refineries in particular with the long-range weapons, the ATACMS and the F-16s we had given Ukraine. I made that case privately as well as publicly to the Biden administration. 4 of Russia's best oil refineries, for example, the ones that have the highest throughput, are situated around Moscow within range of ATACMS. And we should have struck them with Ukrainian weapons. The sanctions regime, particularly against industrial goods, has real teeth to it. It would have been very challenging for Russia to repair those oil refineries. And it would have been put in a position where, ironically, its biggest problem was that it had too much crude and not enough refined, right? Their war economy runs on petroleum, not on crude. And they would have been in a situation where they would have been selling some of the crude oil onto the market, the global markets, in a way that would have made our price cap against oil even more effective. So it was really a win-win-win. Very frustrated that Biden didn't do that ultimately. So I agree with that. Ideally, we would do that now. Ideally, we would tighten the oil and gas sanctions that we already have in place. And all of these things were working. One of the most frustrating aspects over the last year was this narrative that Russia was winning. Russia was not winning. Russia was sacrificing thousands of casualties for every kilometer gained. They had double-digit inflation in the rear, depleting tanks and armored personnel carriers that they cannot replace at the front lines, low morale, manpower shortages everywhere. They're in tough shape. I'm not saying the Russians are going to give up tomorrow, but this is not perennially sustainable for the Russian war economy, not even as good as the technocrats around Putin are, and they are very good. So absolutely Ukraine can win. I think what I would contest is that let's imagine that they kick the Russians out of that, that 18% of Ukrainian territory that Russia holds right now. What I described earlier, they're still going to need, regardless of where that eastern border is, whether it's the pre-2014 eastern border, whether it's the post-2025 eastern border. They need that multi-layered defense, and they need to be able to pay for it, and they need to make it credible, and they need to do it outside of NATO. So that means they need a front line, they need a rapid response force, and they need to be able to protect critical infrastructure, or else the Russian bear is going to be on the prowl yet again.
I think the hope going back to 2022 or 2023 is that Ukraine could have a breakthrough in Zaporizhia, isolate Crimea, retake Crimea, and that would be such a prestige blow to Putin that it would trigger a regime change within the Kremlin. If Putin couldn't even hold on to Crimea, which he had before he launched the full-scale invasion, the thinking was back then, this was 2 years ago, if Ukraine can make enough progress on the battlefield, this would trigger a political crisis in the Kremlin that would get rid of Putin, because he's the only reason why this war continues. This war, if you want peace, there's only one man who can bring peace to this part of the world, and it's Vladimir Putin, and he's choosing not to. And Donald Trump at the moment is trying to take all of the pressure off him and put all of the blame on Zelensky, when Zelensky is the victim. Zelensky was attacked. His country was attacked. So the next question for you is about weapons deliveries, because this has everyone in Ukraine deeply concerned. Does Donald Trump have the authority to just stop delivering weapons that were approved and allocated by Congress and, discharged under Joe Biden before he left office? Does Trump have the power to just say nothing else is leaving the United States inventories, everything that we already have contracts for, the money was already spent, the delivery dates were already signed, I'm just going to stop everything?
It probably depends on which authority is being used to transfer the weapons. So we give presidential drawdown authority, and then Congress specifically designated certain types of armaments that it was going to send. Now, my understanding is that before he left office, President Biden really made a push to get all that material in that latter bucket to Ukraine, whether by ship or by air. And so it's likely that Trump is using presidential drawdown authority, which is to say he's dipping into existing stocks. If he's using that to send this aid, he probably does have the authority, because he can make a determination that it's contrary to U.S. national security. And that's something that Congress allows presidents to do if they're doing drawdown authority. But I'd have to see which authorities he's using. I have no doubt at the broader level, though, that he's going to use either that threat or that actuality as leverage against Zelensky. And here again, we are just seeing such incompetence from the president. The last thing you want to do is undercut your allies before you've gone to the negotiating table. We have to project strength and unity, not be negotiating against ourselves in the open. I mean, you look at what Hegseth was saying 2 weeks ago. He went to Europe and unilaterally took NATO off the table before Russia had even opened its mouth. I mean, we gave one of the greatest sort of concessions you can imagine just by negotiating against ourselves.
And he promised no American boots on the ground at all.
Unbelievable. And regardless of whether you think NATO was ever on the table or American boots were ever on the table, let the Kremlin ask and get an extraction of a concession in a turn. I mean, Hegseth is such an embarrassment. I cringe every time I see him going overseas and talking to our allies, because they must be rolling their eyes. And the one thing I can say about the Russians and who they are sending to Saudi Arabia or to any of these negotiations, these are hardened diplomats. These are guys who have been doing this for 25 years, and they know the ins and outs. And they're going to look at our junior varsity team and think, we're going to eat these Americans for breakfast.
So when we go back to the actual votes last April or May, when the last supplemental in Congress was passed, it had a majority of Republican senators voting in favor of it. It had about 50% of House Republicans voting in favor of it. Military aid to Ukraine was always bipartisan and popular with supermajorities in Congress. So my question to you is, now that Trump is president, a lot of these guys have disappeared. They've vanished. They're not attacking Ukraine or Zelensky, but they're not speaking up. They're not defending the international rules-based order, our NATO partners, or our values that we're supposed to share with our military allies. So I just want to get your thoughts, your impressions. What are Republicans in Congress saying and doing who 6 months ago were strong supporters of Ukraine and today they're holding back?
I think you're using the wrong bellwether a year ago for Republican support. So that appropriations package you're talking about was Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan all together. That's why it got a majority of Republicans, is because of Israel. If it had been Ukraine alone, the right place to look is on individual amendments about Ukraine that were put up. I think there was one amendment about $300 million for Ukraine that was meant to be, if I'm recollecting, was a year ago, and it was meant to be sort of a test balloon about where Republican support was on Ukraine by itself. At that point, it got only a minority and maybe a plurality, but I don't it got a minority of Republicans. I know that for sure. So
So,
Republican support.
based on your logic, though, like they wanted for the Republicans who obviously all support Israel because that's the official position of their party, they still were willing to vote against Israel because they wanted to vote against Ukraine stronger than they wanted to vote for
That's
Israel.
right.
So you're saying the real debate was how much more anti-Ukraine are you than you are pro-Israel? Because obviously they merged those two together. Actually, that's not true. Didn't the House vote individually and then the Senate voted all together? Like it was voted on differently.
The House passed it together, and as did the Senate. But there have been individual Ukraine votes in the House that serve as a bellwether for Republican support, multiple, and there were some amendments, and they all demonstrated minority Republican support for Ukraine last year. And the short answer to your question, though, regardless of whatever the tabulations, the short answer to your question is majority of Republicans understand privately the value of Ukraine and of NATO, but they're afraid of Donald Trump. I mean, I wish I had a more satisfying answer for our listeners.
Yeah.
But that's the answer. They don't want to get a primary, and they're sick of explaining it to their base voters back home. And so the real answer to that frustration isn't about persuading individual Republicans, because a lot of them already agree with you. It's about changing our primary system. In our country, 400 out of 435 members of Congress are oriented towards their primary, because that's the actual competitive election in their district, and not towards their general election. We need to get rid of the primary system and have just a top two system where you have to compete for the median voter in your district. It's what California does. Alaska does a great version of this. So it's possible. And there's a group called Veterans for All Voters, which is trying to make it happen in other states. If you did that, you would get Republicans who had to be much more oriented towards that median voter who, as we were talking about earlier in this conversation, does not think it's acceptable for the American president to favor Russia over freedom and democracy.
So you're saying the states who determine their own elections,
Yes.
A better system would be everyone, regardless of Democrats and Republicans, has to compete in a primary vote. And I'm guessing you would vote for a single person. Yes, you can have a D next to their name, you can have an R next to their name, but the primary only determines the top two. And then the top two compete in the general election. Whoever gets the most votes then gets the seat in Congress. Is that how I understand it correctly?
That's broadly right. Technically, it's called a preliminary, not a primary in that system, but yes. And it can be, you can put some different spin on the ball there. Alaska has ranked choice voting in that general, so you can get fancy with it. But yes, that's the general idea. As I said, states are already doing this, and no system is perfect. If anybody claims a silver bullet for our democracy, they're selling you something. But boy, does it change incentives for politicians, because now you're thinking about, it's not just my 20th percentile voter who's ideologically intense and shows up for a primary. I'm thinking about my 50th percentile voter, lower information, but more ideologically mainstream, showing up in the general election. And you heal a lot of our tribalism in Congress that way.
So it's called a preliminary, not a primary.
Yes, we're getting rid of primaries is the goal.
That actually would be very smart. So I like that idea. Let's now turn to a very serious topic that I'm sure has you as a veteran very concerned, but Trump, the Friday night massacre at the Pentagon, he fired the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I think the Chief of the Navy, as well as all of these JAGs, these Judge Advocate Generals. So yeah, I just want to get your reaction and thoughts to Trump's purge of the military, top commanders, and legal experts, and how concerned should people be?
I don't use the word purge deliberately because we've got 4 years of Trump, and Democrats need to be disciplined about how much we dial up the outrage on his every action. Because if we take it to a 12 out of 10 in the first 2 months, we're going to desensitize the American public. I was in the chamber on January 6, 2021. I know what a constitutional crisis feels like and looks like. What it feels like is when you've got a mob of people trying to hang the vice president and kill the Speaker of the House. We are not there yet. We're in a constitutional fight for sure. We are not yet in a constitutional crisis. The president, there's 44 flag officers. The president is allowed to choose who his top military advisors are. That's within his constitutional authority. He is allowed to fire them. He's allowed to promote them. He's allowed to make decisions about how promotions will work. All of that is roughly within Article 2 remit. Of the 44 or so, I think he fired 6 or 7. So it's not a purge. What I would be very concerned about, the tripwire that I'm looking at very carefully, is if he institutes these warrior boards that he has discussed. Right now, the process of a 2-star going to a 3 or 4-star is pretty well-defined procedure where their full career is evaluated by fellow officers and by civilian superiors at the Pentagon, and it's a relatively transparent process. I'm sure there's politics at play at the Pentagon, don't get me wrong, but overall, it's kind of separated from the president's party. What he's talking about now is a warrior board system where retired officers, presumably those who are MAGA in their retirement, would come in, and on these warrior boards, they would vet people who wanted to put on a 3rd or a 4th star. That becomes a political test to be a top military commander. That's a real concern. Haven't seen it being instituted the way that he has described it yet, but that's the tripwire I'm waiting for before I start sounding alarm bells.
I would imagine if Trump actually did this, then it would incentivize active duty leadership to start posting on social media, to send out their credentials to the public, to get the MAGA base on their side. If they want that 2nd, 3rd, or 4th star, they would have to enter the political arena and start criticizing initiatives by Democrats or liberals or whatever, wouldn't it? Like,
Right.
How else do you evaluate them?
That's the nightmare we're trying to avoid, precisely that. The most important event, one of the most important events in American political history, was George Washington handing over his sword at Newburgh after he had successfully led the Continental Army to victory over the British. And it was an astounding act where this general, who was the most powerful person by far in America, said, it's up to the civilians to architect our governance and to decide how they want to run things in this country now. And Americans for the next 250 years have roughly taken for granted that our military is a non-political entity. And Trump is very, very much rattling that complacency. And we cannot take it for granted.
Since you're a member of Congress and you make laws, I have to ask you the legal question. Does Donald Trump have this authority? 25% tariffs in violation of international treaties ratified by Congress, or at least the Senate. 25% tariffs, as well as sanctions being placed on countries, sanctions being placed on people or lifted. Does the president actually have this authority and power to arbitrarily, whatever numbers, whatever system he wants, place sanctions, lift sanctions, place tariffs, or lift tariffs?
He probably does, but he shouldn't. And what I mean by that is Congress granted the presidency in the last 50 years or so an ability to set tariffs under emergency powers that is quite expansive. And he has abused that power enormously to basically just say that he can dictate what tariffs are going to be for any given country at any given time. And this speaks to a much more profound problem that we have with Article 2, which is that since Nixon in particular, you could argue since FDR, Congress has ceded way too much of its power to the presidency. We've created an imperial presidency in America. And listen, Democratic presidents have overreached as well, but Trump has put this thing on steroids now. And what we need to do is build bipartisan consensus in Congress, not to take Trump down, because Republican members aren't going to be able to subscribe to that, at least not right now, but to constitutionally restore Article 2 to its rightful place, which is second among equals. We have 3 branches of government: Congress, the presidency, and the Supreme Court. Congress is Article 1. Ultimately, we are the people's house. And if Congress tells the president what to do, he or she must make sure that the laws are faithfully executed. And what we have gotten to right now is a place where Congress has said, this whole lawmaking thing feels pretty complicated. We're going to write these big, expansive bills with a ton of discretion embedded within them and allow any given president to decide major issues of national economy and security on his own. And that has made every single 4 years this titanic battle between D and R over control of the most powerful office in the land. We've got to cut the presidency down to size.
So I guess a historical analogy would be Kenneth Starr, the special prosecutor under Bill Clinton, who was allowed to act independently. And then I guess the provision that gave him his authority and power once Bush became president, the Democrats were happy to let that go away. This power that was created to investigate Bill Clinton, and Republicans were happy to let it go away as well. So is there a future presidency where Democrats and Republicans could work together to restrain the powers of the president, to stop this imperial presidency that Trump is exerting he has the authority to be?
It'll have to happen in the lame duck session, I think. So just to be specific about it, last year, Rand Paul in the Senate and Chip Roy in the House, two conservative Republicans, put forward bipartisan pieces of legislation. They both had Democratic co-sponsors to cut down the president's ability to use emergency powers. And emergency powers are one example, but maybe the chief example of what I would call the imperial presidency. And big bipartisan bill. They passed with big majorities. They never actually became law. But it was this glimmer of, okay, maybe it's possible. Now,
did the president veto it? I don't remember hearing about this.
No, what happened was, sorry, I should have been more clear. What happened was the Senate and the House passed slightly different versions. The Senate, I'm not actually sure, came up for a Senate-wide vote. The House did. And so they never reconciled. And then
there's no reconciliation. Okay.
And then Trump won, and then Republicans backed off. So that's kind of the punchline here, is that Trump won, and then Republicans said, oh, actually, I don't really want to do reining in the executive branch anymore. Probably this kind of reform has to happen in the last year of a presidency before an election. By the way, this is true of Supreme Court reform too, where what you need to see is you need to be behind the Rawlsian veil of ignorance, right? And everybody has to be designing government as they wish it would work without knowing the outcome of an election. That's where you start to see the kind of good governance policy happen. But we got to do the spade work for that good policy now. 2 years happens fast.
I know the big battle in Congress over the next 2 weeks is the debt ceiling. Obviously, there's going to be a reconciliation process for the two different versions of this omnibus spending bill. But I have to ask you, with all of the other norms being broken currently by Trump, is the debt ceiling going to be lifted? And what happens if it isn't lifted?
My vote doesn't come cheap. I will speak for myself, not for the entire Democratic caucus. I am not going to vote to support this administration in its funding aims, in its treasury requirements regarding the debt, without enforceable provisions to enforce the Impoundment Act. The Impoundment Act is the inverse of emergency powers. So emergency powers allow the presidency to do things that Congress didn't say that he could do. I have a real problem with that. But impoundment is almost the opposite. The impoundment is when the president doesn't do things that Congress said you do have to do. Neither of those are acceptable. Those are the two sides of the coin of an imperial presidency. And in the appropriations fight coming up, we have got to get enforceable provisions around impoundment. They cannot just not spend money that we appropriate. They have to spend it to the amount that we say and how we say. Otherwise, we're not a legislature, we're a board of advisors, and that's not acceptable.
Do you think the Supreme Court is going to back you guys up?
My intuition about the Supreme Court is that they're going to make two different kinds of decisions against Trump's depredations. The first kind of decisions are going to be about the unitary executive theory. The unitary executive theory says that a president within Article 2, within the executive branch, is an absolute emperor, that he can fire the National Labor Relations Board chair, that he can fire inspectors general, that he can dismantle the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, that he can dismantle the Department of Education. If it's within Article 2, the president is the only named entity within Article 2, and he is absolutely in charge. I disagree with that. I think that Congress can tell Article 2 what to do, and he needs to make sure that the laws are faithfully executed. But there is a 50-year jurisprudence around the unitary executive theory that 6 out of the 9 Supreme Court justices seem to be sympathetic to. And I expect they will uphold in their rulings that Donald Trump, within Article 2, is almost all-powerful. I disagree with that. Our Constitution can survive that, though. That is at least a cohesive point of view about how Article 2 works. The other thing they're going to rule about, though, is how Article 2 relates to Article 1. And that goes back to emergency powers and to impoundment, which is to say when Congress explicitly tells the president what you are allowed to do in regards to how you govern this country, whether it's spending money or otherwise, you have to listen to Congress. There, I expect the Supreme Court is going to support Congress because they, in general, in their rulings, have been pretty hostile to the administrative state stepping on declared congressional intent. If he ignores those rulings, that is when I'll use the crisis word.
It's coming this summer. Get ready. Going back to foreign policy, I have a lot of international viewers, and all of my international viewers are deeply concerned with Donald Trump's rhetoric about Greenland and Panama and Gaza and especially Canada. So I just have to get your thoughts because, like, when Donald Trump talks about Canada becoming the 51st state, that's offensive. One, that would be disastrous. Two, but also just functionally, wouldn't you have to redraw every congressional district to shrink representation in existing states in order to create new delegates, new congressmen for 40 million people in Canada, in addition to the 2 senators? That's easy. But I'm just thinking of the logistics of trying to make Canada the 51st state. How can anybody, when you actually sit down and think about the legality and the complications, why is anyone taking this idea of Canada becoming part of the United States serious when there's so many roadblocks in the way that would be very painful for both countries to go through?
Yeah, you also have Republican members of Congress hooting and hollering on Twitter about Team USA and Team Canada fighting at hockey and sort of like chest thumping about us winning fights on the ice. Meanwhile, we're genuflecting in front of Vladimir Putin. And it's like, guys, you are so totally lost the script about what makes America powerful and respected globally. Like, if you think, jeering at Canada makes you look tough, you're just a moron. Here's what our international viewers, though, I think, and frankly, our American viewers need to do is they need to put Donald Trump on mute for the next 4 years. He's going to say a tremendous number of dumb things, and very few of it is going to happen. It'll be bound up in the realities of governance and by Congress and by the courts and by the administration, the administrators, I should say. What he is trying to do is flood the zone. And Steve Bannon talked about this in 2019. He comes in and he's issuing ideas at muzzle velocity. They're half-baked ideas. Some of them are popular. Some of them are not. Some of them are outrageous. Some of them have a kernel of good idea wrapped in a shroud of corruption and chaos, like his immigration visa issue thing, gold cards. The goal is not to actually affect those policies immediately or even ultimately. The goal is to disorient and demoralize so that people don't pay attention to what they're actually doing. What they are actually doing, the work that they are really trying to do right now in Washington, is they're trying to pass $4.5 trillion of tax cuts for people who don't need tax cuts. And they're paying for it, one, by exploding the debt, and two, by trying to axe Medicaid, which provides healthcare to 40% of kids in this country and healthcare to at-home seniors. That's super unpopular. Like 3/4 of Americans really like Medicaid. Very few Americans think it's a good idea for the 1% to get 50% of the benefits of a tax cut. So they don't want to talk about it. So instead, they want us to talk about invading Panama or, whatever Elon Musk tweets the next day. Our job as Democrats is to be ferociously disciplined. Yes, we got to play defense to support the rule of law, but most we have to go on offense because he's going to talk this good economy into a recession. And we've got to be there to draw that contrast to average voters who are not tuned in to the ins and outs of politics and say, this guy came in and his chaos and his corruption raised your cost of living, and it did not make you more safe or more proud of this country.
Put Donald Trump on mute the next 4 years. He's going to say a lot of stupid, outrageous, crazy things that, one, his base will love, but is not practical. But then, it's really about corruption and graft and passing tax cuts for the wealthy. So specifically for NATO members, anybody who's in a NATO country, or we can include Australia, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea. What advice would you give to our international partners, our traditional allies who've been with us for 80 years? What advice would you give to them in response to Donald Trump insulting them or offending them or genuinely trying to form new economic cooperation and ventures with Russia, as well as providing cover for the Chinese, who are the two biggest antagonizers in the world?
Unfortunately, the Prime Minister of Great Britain or the President of Taiwan doesn't have the benefit of the mute button. They have to take him seriously, don't they? Because he speaks for American military and economic might overseas and the integrity of our diplomacy. I think they have to take a number of strategies, different in Europe versus the Indo-Pacific. In Europe, we got to see the European Union extend the Lisbon Treaty's Article 42.7 to Ukraine, and they got to take more responsibility, particularly on the army side of this house. If you look at NATO as one big military, which obviously it's not, but in general, Europe needs to do a lot more on the army, and America needs to do a lot more on the navy, because we've got to be ready in the Indo-Pacific for Chinese belligerents over the next decade. So the European Union, I think, needs to invest in its own defense industrial base, take ownership of Ukraine's security with this void of American security leadership on the issue, and help implement the multilateral layering of Ukrainian defense that I discussed, using those Russian frozen assets to pay for it, which are based in Brussels. The EU has full control over doing that, and they've been the ones who are dragging their feet. So they can pay for this roughly million-man army that Ukraine is likely to need. Europeans also have to resist the urge of looking to China. China is going to try to make inroads to Europe and say, I'll be your protector, I'll be the guarantor. They need to resist that. That would be just as catastrophic for Europe as relying on cheap Russian energy was for Germany, right? In the Indo-Pacific, there really is no alternative to the United States. And Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, they really need to continue to invest in Congress, because there is massive bipartisan support for our Indo-Pacific alliances in Congress. All of those that I just mentioned have 3/4 level support in Congress. And remember that it was Congress that took lead on Taiwan in the 1970s and has continued to be the most, of all the branches, the most vocal and aggressive about supporting Taiwan. It's going to be the same thing for Japan, South Korea, Philippines, Australia, going forward. They need to be building out strong bipartisan support for those bilateral alliances here in Congress.
I agree. Let's zoom out now that we're 3 or 4 months away from the election and reflect on why Kamala Harris lost. And we were speaking briefly about this before we started recording, about this new age of social media. And I'm convinced that there was a flip in the last 4 years and the Democrats didn't understand it. They didn't get it. That I believe a majority of Americans now get their news and information and they form their opinions from social media, not legacy or corporate media. There are so many knowledgeable and fantastic people trying to get information out there, but they're saying, I've got a book coming out this fall, or, go to my Substack, subscribe, and you can read my article, or, when the right just puts it out there. These people on the right-wing media, it's on every platform, blasted continuously, spam. Doesn't matter if it's true, doesn't matter if it makes sense. Keep talking, keep blasting. Where I think intellectuals, people on the left, they're very cautious about what they say. They don't want to say one incorrect thing because they believe that will destroy their reputation. So they're cautious, they're reserved. In general, they don't enjoy being on social media because it's toxic and nauseating sometimes. But this is where the fight is. This is where the average American voter is now getting their information and forming their opinions. It's not from 5 to 7 minute segments in between commercial breaks on MSNBC or CNN. So I believe the Democrats had this belief that they just had the facts and the truth on their side. Traditional corporate media would report it and Americans would take it in. So I really appreciate you reaching out to me and coming on my YouTube channel. This was a risk for you. So going forward, what would you like to see your Democratic colleagues doing? What do you want to see the nominee for the Democratic Party in 2028 doing to reach voters who, I'll be honest, have given up on watching corporate media, legacy media? My father, he's 72 years old. He's going to watch this podcast. He exclusively now just watches YouTube on his television. He has YouTube Premium, so there's no commercials. And he loves it. He said he's never going back to cable news where there's a commercial break every 5 to 7 minutes.
You're right. Not sure I can improve upon what you said. I think that legacy media doesn't get replaced any more than, radio got replaced by TV or the printing press got replaced by the telegraph, right? These things, legacy media does stay with us and they occupy niches going forward. But there's no doubt that over the last 5 years, creator media has devoured corporate media, and the stats on screen time play that out. I believe individuals under 40 in this country consume 4 to 6 hours of online video, audio, or text content every single day. So the idea that you can win them over with these packaged up talking points that you pump into a 30-second ad just doesn't scrub, right? People want to hear an hour-long conversation. People want to understand the depth of your ideas, and they want to pressure test whether they think you're fit for governance or not. And we've got to be able to engage. It's no longer the article; it's the comment section, right? We got to get in there. What do I want to see the 2028 candidate do? Even before, though, their ability to communicate across various mediums, they need to have big ideas. Our party does not have a wellspring of bold new ideas for governance about how to make housing less expensive, about how to make healthcare less expensive, about how to create jobs, about our national security posture. I think over the last 10 years, we have been too reactive to MAGA. They do something, we don't like it. They do something else, we don't like it. Trump tweets something, we really don't like that. And it has, I think, impaired our ability to generate our own set of big and bold ideas. And I've put some out there in the past. For example, I think that we should be building new cities in this country again. Americans used to build cities every time they bumped into a river. And over the last 50 years, we've stopped developing new cities. It's impaired our ability to produce housing at the scale that we need, which is about 10 million units of housing. It's impaired our ability to bootstrap nuclear power. We need to build probably 150 nuclear power plants over the next 10 years to become energy dominant and to outmatch China, which is exporting nuclear energy now to the global south. And it's also an opportunity to innovate and incubate new ideas. We could try car-free cities. We could try cities with special immigration statuses. It speaks to, I think, a sense of dynamism that this country has been lacking now in the 21st century. And yet, to your point, too many policymakers feel like if they put out big ideas and they don't immediately make sense in the format of a bill, they're going to get rejected. Now is a time, as we are preparing for the next presidential election cycle and this party is looking for new leadership, for us to be pumping new ideas out into the ether and then have them be improved upon and come back to us in tighter formats. That's how the party can, I think, generate the governance that voters are hungry for.
I like this idea, but geographically, where should we be building new cities?
33% of American land is federally owned, and much of that, even in the denser Northeast, is decommissioned military bases. So, for example, in my home state of Massachusetts, we've got 2 decommissioned military bases that have significant horizontal infrastructure and that don't have local zoning attached to them. We also have a prison system that's about to get closed that similarly has a big chunk of land that is not touched by municipal zoning, or is only, I should say, marginally subject to municipal zoning. What we need to do is cut through the red tape and the vetocracy that has inhibited our ability to build big again. Because the scale of housing production that we need as a country vastly dwarfs our current pace of production. And I'm a housing maximalist. I think housing underpins much of our economic ill in this country right now. If we don't produce the housing that we need, we are going to suffocate millennials and Gen Zers' ability to build wealth and to afford a middle-class lifestyle. Baby boomers will do great, don't get me wrong. Their property will continue to appreciate on the exponential curve it has since the 1970s. But everybody who wasn't born in 1960 or earlier isn't going to be able to afford a house.
As a millennial, I'm assuming you're a millennial as well. Yeah, it was stressful. I just purchased my first home last year. I had been renting for my entire life. And when you rent, it just goes up every year.
Yep.
Every year, the rent goes up faster than your wages, faster than other budgetary costs. I remember what it was like in the 90s, and it didn't feel like this.
No,
and I think Donald Trump tapped that rage and that anger. People upset about rent increases and the price of eggs, and he promised a lot of things: no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, and then this bill in Congress was passed, and none of that was in there. Nothing to help the average person who is struggling with the cost of living.
Oh, they're going to see, the average person is going to see their home and car insurance and their utility bills spike by double digits over the next 18 months. Insurance bills, particularly for home
all
and
these
car.
tariffs coming. Yeah.
That's what I mean. There's two things that are going to happen. One is the tariffs, and the second is the expiration of temporary protected status for a huge number of immigrant workers. The construction sector is, I don't know, 30, 40%, I believe, immigrant workforce, the most dependent sector of any in the American economy on immigrant labor. And so if you look at the tariffs on steel, aluminum, lumber, and semiconductors, plus the reliance of home and of auto, and particularly on home on a migrant workforce, what you have are two heavily inflationary effects. And home and car insurance, those premiums are a message from the future about what it will cost to rebuild or repair your home or your car. Those are going to spike in the next month or two. 20% would be my guess for both of those in most parts of the country.
Well, that's not a positive thought. We're coming up towards the end of the podcast here, Jake. So I want to get your closing thoughts, closing arguments to the audience. There's a lot of people out there who watch my channel who are deeply disturbed and concerned about the state of American politics. What message do you have for them? What advice do you have for them going forward?
America is bigger and better than one bad president. And as a country, I still remain confident that we are going to be here to support the Pax Americana and to be a city upon a hill.
I agree. It's not going to be fun the next 3 years and 10 months. And I don't think anybody knows how this is going to play out. I think a lot of characters in the story in the White House are going to change potentially.
Yes.
And we just have to rely on state governments and for them to manage what Trump is going to try and do. So thank you so much for your time, Congressman. I really appreciate you reaching out to me. We'll have this podcast up soon. If you ever want to come back and talk about what's going on in Congress, I would love to see you again. As well, tell your colleagues to get out there on social media. I mean, I've been here 3 years advocating for Ukraine on social media, and it's been a nightmare. All of these large right-wing accounts on X just repeating whatever Elon Musk tells them to say. But I do think the election of Donald Trump woke a lot of people up. And I think the game has changed. And now that we know the rules of the new game that they've been playing it the last 4 years, we're going to win. We're going to overcome this. It's not going to be easy, but we are going to make it. So, Congressman, thank you so much for your time. I wish you all the luck in the people's house.
Thanks, Jake, for having me on. Be well.